All right, on today's Explainer, we are diving deep into a band that, let's be honest, defined an entire era for a whole lot of us. We're talking about Good Charlotte. I mean, think about the early 2000s. You couldn't escape them. They were all over MTV, all over the radio, that perfect mix of skate punk energy and these huge, catchy pop hooks. But here's the thing. Their story is so much more than just a couple of big hits. It's really a lesson in hustle, in how to change with the times, and what it means to build a legacy. So to really get a handle on their impact, we're going to look at the whole story. We'll start with how they clawed their way out of a small town in Maryland. Then we'll get into what happens when you suddenly become famous all over the world. We'll also look at the big creative chances they took, why they had to just stop for a while. And finally, we'll try to unpack what their kind of complicated legacy is today. Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. How did this all happen? Before all the fame, before they were selling out arenas, you gotta remember, Good Charlotte was really just a couple of kids from this small town, Waldorf, Maryland. And the key thing here is they had a very specific plan. So right at the center of it all, you have the twin brothers, Joel and Benji Madden. And here's a fun little fact that kind of proves you can't judge a book by its cover, or a punk band by its name. Where did they get the name Good Charlotte? From a children's book. No joke. And this is what I was talking about when I said they had a plan. The Madden brothers were, well, they were methodical. This wasn't just some vague dream. They didn't just sit around waiting for a lucky break. They went out and engineered one. They were literally reading books on the music industry, making their own press kits, and just playing show after show after show. They treated it like a full-time job. And you know what? All that grinding, all that hard work, it absolutely paid off. They started getting some airplay on local radio, which created a bit of a buzz. That buzz got them a showcase in New York City, and that's where the major labels started paying attention. By May of 2000, boom, they signed a deal with Epic Records. The rocket was officially on the launch pad. Okay, so they've got the record deal. The stage is totally set for them to just explode into the mainstream. Now, their first album did okay, it made some waves, but it was that second album that's the one that made them household names. Just look at this number. 4.9 million. That's how many copies their 2002 album, The Young and the Hopeless, sold around the world. I mean, think about that. This wasn't just a hit record. It was a cultural moment. This album launched them into a whole other stratosphere. And what drove that massive success? Well, it was a whole string of hits that you just could not get away from. Seriously. Songs like Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, the Anthem, these weren't just deep cuts on an album. They became the soundtrack for a generation. They were blasting out of every car radio. They were on MTV basically 24/7. And this right here is so key to understanding just how big they got. They bridged a huge gap. Suddenly, they weren't just a rock band anymore. Their songs were so catchy, so relatable, that they crossed over onto top 40 pop radio. That's what turned them into this massive cultural phenomenon. I mean, they were staples on shows like TRL, which was everything back then. So, imagine this. You've reached the absolute top. You're at the peak of the pop-punk mountain. The big question is, what do you do next? Do you just do the same thing all over again? Well, Good Charlotte didn't. Instead of just repeating the formula, they decided to get experimental. And you can really see this evolution on this timeline here. They're clearly grappling with their own success, their own identity. First, in 2004, they follow up their huge hit with a much darker, more ambitious album. Then, a few years later, with Good Morning Revival, they pivot hard into this dance punk synth-heavy sound. It was a huge change. And then finally, in 2010, they kind of come back home to their pop-punk roots with Cardiology. It was definitely a creatively restless time for them. Well, as you can probably guess, all of that, the constant touring, the recording, the pressure of changing your sound, it eventually takes a toll. It really did. And it led to a break that they absolutely needed. But that break also set the stage for a pretty powerful comeback. So in 2011, after more than a decade of just nonstop work, the band made it official. They were going on hiatus. And if you look at this timeline of the band members, you can see two things. First, how consistent the core group was for years, but you also see that big 4-year gap where everything just stops. That was a super important time for them to recharge before they officially came back in late 2015. And when they did come back, Well, they weren't the same kids from Maryland anymore. Their music had really grown up with them. Their 2018 album, Generation RX, showed this new maturity. They were tackling some incredibly serious, heavy stuff. Things like the opioid epidemic, mental health struggles, self-esteem. It was a whole new level for them. So that brings us to the big question, right? After this whole journey, what is Good Charlotte's legacy? And the answer, well, like it is for a lot of bands this huge, it's complicated. I mean, the opinions on their legacy are just worlds apart. You've got some critics who basically saw them as the definition of a generic sellout scene. But on the other hand, you have millions and millions of fans, and even some legit publications that rank them as one of the most important pop-punk bands of all time. So in the end, it's really up to you. Were they pioneers who brought a punk attitude to millions? Or were they just a product of their time? Whatever you decide, one thing is for sure. Their impact on an entire generation is just undeniable. They totally defined a moment in time, and their story really leaves us with this final question to think about. What's the cost of fame? How do you evolve? And what does it really mean to last?